Silence changes people. Not because silence always means the same thing, but because the human mind cannot tolerate unanswered questions for very long. It begins filling in the blanks. It invents explanations. It rewrites memories. It searches for certainty where none exists. That's why the moment someone finally reappears after a long period of distance often feels far more emotionally intense than either person expects. The interesting part isn't simply that contact happens. The interesting part is what happens inside the nervous system when it does. Many people assume the first conversation after a long silence will immediately reveal everything. They expect a confession, an apology, or a dramatic emotional breakthrough. Human behavior is usually much quieter than that. When someone who has spent a long time avoiding difficult conversations finally decides to engage again, the first thing you'll often notice isn't confidence. It's caution. Watch the pace. People who have spent weeks or months emotionally distant frequently test the environment before they fully step back into it. Their questions may seem ordinary. Their tone may sound almost casual. But beneath that calm surface, they're often gathering information. Has anything changed? Are you angry? Are you distant? Are you welcoming? Is this conversation emotionally safe? Notice that these questions don't have to be spoken aloud. Behavior answers them long before words do. This is something behavioral analysts pay close attention to. People rarely enter uncertain situations without first collecting feedback. Sometimes that feedback comes from facial expressions. Sometimes from voice tone. Sometimes from response speed. Sometimes from nothing more than whether the interaction feels tense or relaxed. The nervous system is constantly updating predictions. Every smile, every pause, every shift in body language becomes data. This process happens so quickly that most people never consciously realize they're doing it. Now consider what long periods of silence actually accomplish psychologically. Distance doesn't erase emotional memories. In many cases, it simply interrupts reinforcement. The memories remain. The emotional associations remain. What changes is the amount of new information entering the system. Without new experiences, the brain often returns to familiar ones. Sometimes those memories become idealized. Sometimes they become distorted. Sometimes both happen at the same time. This is why reunions after long periods apart often feel strangely familiar even when both people have changed. The brain isn't meeting a complete stranger. It's reconnecting with an unfinished pattern. That unfinished pattern creates psychological tension. Human beings naturally prefer completion. Researchers sometimes describe this as the mind's tendency to keep unresolved experiences mentally active until they reach some form of conclusion. Again, every situation is different. Not every silence reflects unresolved feelings. Sometimes it reflects incompatible goals. Sometimes overwhelming life circumstances. Sometimes uncertainty. Sometimes fear of conflict. Context always matters. But when someone chooses to reconnect after considerable distance, it's often worth paying attention to what their behavior communicates during those first few interactions, rather than expecting immediate explanations. Observe whether curiosity returns. Do they ask thoughtful questions? Do they remember previous conversations? Do they reference shared experiences naturally? These behaviors suggest that older memories remained accessible rather than disappearing completely. Memory follows relevance. The more emotionally significant an experience becomes, the easier it is for the brain to retrieve associated details later. Another fascinating pattern involves emotional pacing. People returning after extended silence often avoid diving immediately into emotionally charged topics. Instead, they rebuild familiarity first. Small conversations, shared humor, simple observations. This gradual approach allows both nervous systems to adjust. Think of it like stepping into cold water. Few people jump directly into the deepest part. Most adjust one step at a time. Human relationships often work similarly. Safety usually develops incrementally rather than instantly. This doesn't necessarily mean someone lacks sincerity. Sometimes gradual engagement reflects emotional caution rather than emotional absence. Watch what happens after the initial conversation. That's where reliable information usually appears. Anyone can send one message. Patterns emerge in what follows. Do conversations naturally continue? Does responsiveness become more consistent? Is there increasing comfort over time? Or does communication immediately disappear again? Behavior across multiple interactions tells a more complete story than any single conversation ever could. Experienced observers know that isolated moments are emotionally powerful, but analytically weak. Patterns provide stronger evidence than peaks. That's why attention should stay focused on repeated behavior rather than dramatic interpretations. Notice whether accountability appears naturally. People rebuilding a connection often acknowledge the impact of the distance in different ways. Some address it directly. Others reveal it indirectly through increased consistency moving forward. Actions sometimes communicate responsibility more effectively than lengthy explanations. The key is not assuming one conversation determines everything. Relationships, when they recover, usually do so through repeated demonstrations of reliability rather than one emotionally perfect discussion. Perhaps the biggest mistake people make after a long silence is believing they must immediately define the relationship. Human psychology rarely moves that quickly. Trust is reconstructed through accumulated experiences, conversation by conversation, choice by choice, day by day. That process may feel slow, but slow isn't necessarily a sign of failure. Sometimes it's simply the pace required for confidence to return. If someone truly wants to rebuild a meaningful connection, the strongest signal usually isn't found in one emotional speech. It's found in whether today's behavior begins looking different from yesterday's. Because people can rehearse explanations. They can prepare apologies. They can choose impressive words. But sustained consistency requires something words alone can never replace. Repeated action. And repeated action is where genuine change becomes visible. One of the most revealing moments comes after that first conversation ends. Most people think the reunion itself contains all the answers. It rarely does. The real information appears afterward. Behavioral analysts know something that most people overlook. The first interaction is often influenced by emotion, uncertainty, and anticipation. The interactions that follow reveal what happens once those emotions settle. Ask yourself a simple question. Does the communication become easier, or does it immediately return to the same pattern of distance? People are remarkably consistent over time, unless something meaningful has changed. That doesn't mean people can't grow. They absolutely can. It means genuine change is usually reflected through repeated behavior rather than isolated moments. Think about cognitive effort. Every relationship requires mental energy, remembering conversations, making plans, checking in, resolving misunderstandings. When someone willingly invests that energy over time, it often reflects that the relationship has become an important priority. The brain protects its limited attention. It doesn't repeatedly invest in everything equally. This is why consistency deserves far more attention than intensity. Intensity creates memorable moments. Consistency creates dependable patterns. Dependable patterns build trust. Trust changes behavior. Notice whether conversations become more balanced. Earlier, one person may have carried most of the interaction. Now both people begin contributing naturally. Questions become reciprocal. Stories become longer. Silences become comfortable rather than awkward. Comfortable silence is surprisingly informative. People who constantly feel threatened by a conversation often rush to fill every pause. When psychological safety increases, silence stops feeling dangerous. It simply becomes part of the rhythm. That rhythm tells you something, not about certainty, but about comfort. Comfort is one of the strongest foundations of meaningful connection because it allows authenticity to replace performance. Watch how someone handles uncertainty. Suppose plans change unexpectedly. Suppose a misunderstanding occurs. Suppose life becomes stressful. Do they disappear completely? Or do they communicate what is happening? Behavior under stress often reveals more than behavior during calm periods. Stress reduces people's ability to carefully manage impressions. Automatic habits become easier to observe. That's why psychologists frequently study reactions during pressure rather than only during comfort. Pressure exposes default strategies. Some people become quieter. Some become more communicative. Some seek support. Others seek solitude. None of those responses automatically indicate healthy or unhealthy intentions. The important question is whether those responses remain respectful and predictable enough to support trust. Predictability reduces anxiety. The human nervous system responds positively when expectations become reliable. Another subtle shift often appears in language. People begin using more collaborative wording. Instead of speaking only from an individual perspective, conversations naturally include shared possibilities, not promises, not guarantees, simply language that acknowledges another person's presence in future situations. Words like we, together, or sometime become more common. Again, no single phrase proves anything. Patterns matter. Frequency matters. Context matters. Behavioral observation has always been about accumulation rather than isolated clues. One of the most overlooked indicators involves emotional recovery. Every relationship experiences moments of awkwardness. Conversations don't always flow perfectly. Messages occasionally arrive late. Misunderstandings happen. What matters isn't avoiding every uncomfortable moment. It's how quickly both people recover from them. Healthy interactions repair themselves, not because conflict never exists, because both people remain willing to restore understanding. Repair is a skill. It demonstrates flexibility. Rigidity often keeps relationships stuck. Flexibility allows them to grow. Now think about attention during conversation. Does the other person seem mentally present, or merely physically present? There's a profound difference. Presence reveals itself through follow-up questions. Eye contact, remembering details, responding to emotions instead of simply responding to words. Many conversations fail because people listen only long enough to prepare their next sentence. Meaningful conversations develop when people listen long enough to understand. Understanding changes everything. People who feel understood usually become more willing to share additional parts of themselves. That creates a positive cycle. Openness encourages openness. Trust encourages trust. Reliability encourages reliability. Behavior spreads through interaction. This phenomenon is sometimes called reciprocity. People naturally respond to consistent respect with increasing comfort over time. Not always, but often. Another fascinating observation concerns emotional memory. Most people remember facts. Behaviorally significant relationships often involve remembering emotions attached to those facts. They remember that a particular song reminded you of someone important. They remember why a certain place matters. They remember how you felt during an important milestone. Emotional memory reflects deeper processing because it connects information with personal meaning. Meaning strengthens recall. The brain stores emotionally significant experiences differently from routine information. That's why certain conversations remain vivid years later, while dozens of ordinary conversations disappear completely. Notice whether someone creates opportunities for positive interaction without forcing them. Perhaps they share something funny because they know it matches your sense of humor. Perhaps they mention a topic they know you'll enjoy discussing. Perhaps they simply check in without needing a specific reason. These moments seem ordinary, yet relationships are built almost entirely from ordinary moments. Grand gestures attract attention. Small, consistent behaviors sustain connection. Here's another principle worth remembering. Human beings are remarkably adaptive. When something repeatedly brings calm, understanding, or encouragement, the brain gradually begins associating that person with psychological safety. Safety doesn't eliminate attraction. Safety often strengthens meaningful attachment because people naturally return to environments where they experience reduced stress and increased acceptance. This process develops slowly, often so slowly that neither person notices it happening. Then one day they realize conversations have become part of everyday life. Checking in feels natural. Sharing good news feels automatic. Seeking another perspective feels comfortable. Those habits weren't created in one dramatic evening. They emerged through repetition, one reliable interaction after another. That's why experienced behavioral observers rarely chase dramatic conclusions. They observe direction. Is the relationship gradually becoming more open, more dependable, more relaxed, more reciprocal? If the answer continues moving in that direction across weeks and months, the pattern itself becomes more informative than any single emotional moment ever could. Because genuine change is seldom announced. More often, it quietly reveals itself through actions that become so consistent they no longer seem extraordinary, until you realize those ordinary actions have completely transformed the nature of the connection. Here's where careful observation becomes more valuable than assumption. After a long period of silence, it's easy to become hyper-focused on every word the other person says. Every sentence feels loaded with meaning. Every pause feels like a hidden message. Every smile seems to invite interpretation. The mind naturally does this because uncertainty increases attention. When information is limited, the brain works harder to find patterns. Sometimes those patterns are real. Sometimes they're imagined. That's why experienced behavioral observers discipline themselves to separate observation from interpretation. Observation says, they reached out 3 times this week. Interpretation says, they must have realized they can't live without me. Notice the difference. One describes behavior, the other assigns certainty to motivation. Behavior is visible. Motivation is inferred. The most reliable conclusions come from watching behavior accumulate over time. Now pay attention to initiative. Initiative reveals intention more clearly than enthusiasm alone. It's one thing to respond warmly when someone else begins every conversation. It's another thing to create conversations yourself. Who remembers first? Who follows up? Who suggests meeting? Who continues discussions after they could have naturally ended? These questions reveal patterns of investment. Investment is usually measured in repeated effort rather than emotional intensity. Another fascinating shift often appears in emotional timing. When someone becomes more comfortable reconnecting, responses begin feeling less calculated. Conversations become spontaneous. Humor appears naturally. Stories become less rehearsed. People stop trying to create the perfect interaction and begin enjoying the interaction itself. That transition matters. Perfection creates pressure. Comfort creates authenticity. Authenticity allows people to observe one another more accurately. This is why some relationships become stronger after periods of uncertainty. Not because distance itself creates closeness, but because returning requires both people to evaluate what truly matters moving forward. Watch how curiosity evolves. Early questions often concern practical topics. How have you been? What have you been doing? How's work? As familiarity returns, questions frequently become more personal. What have you learned recently? How have you changed? What's been challenging? What are you looking forward to? These conversations move beyond information gathering. They begin exploring perspective. Perspective tells us far more about someone than simple facts ever can. Behavioral psychologists often emphasize that values predict long-term behavior better than isolated preferences. People change favorite restaurants, favorite movies, favorite hobbies. Core values tend to remain much more stable. Someone interested in understanding those values is seeking depth rather than novelty. Notice another subtle behavior. Shared references begin returning. Inside jokes, past experiences, conversations that only the two of you fully understand. These references serve an important social purpose. They reinforce shared identity. They remind both people of common experiences. Memory strengthens connection because it creates continuity. Continuity makes relationships feel stable. The brain appreciates stability because stability increases predictability. Predictability reduces unnecessary stress. Another observation worth considering involves emotional flexibility. Can difficult topics be discussed without everything collapsing? Can disagreements exist without immediate withdrawal? Can misunderstandings become conversations instead of endings? These moments reveal resilience. Every meaningful relationship requires resilience because no two people communicate perfectly all the time. Resilience isn't the absence of problems. It's the ability to recover from them. Recovery requires willingness. Willingness reflects value. People usually protect what they genuinely believe is worth protecting. Observe emotional generosity. Do they assume good intentions? Or do they immediately expect the worst? Healthy communication often begins with charitable interpretation. Instead of reacting impulsively, people ask questions. Instead of making accusations, they seek clarification. This slows conflict before it becomes unnecessary damage. That slowing process demonstrates emotional regulation. Regulation is one of the strongest predictors of stable relationships because it prevents temporary emotions from permanently shaping behavior. Now consider physical presence. When people feel psychologically comfortable, their bodies often become more relaxed. Movements appear less rigid. Expressions become more natural. Laughter becomes easier. Pauses feel less threatening. Again, these are tendencies rather than guarantees. Human behavior varies across personalities and cultures, but increased relaxation frequently accompanies increasing trust. Trust changes posture before it changes vocabulary. One of the most interesting principles in behavioral observation is that people reveal priorities through repetition. Anyone can create one impressive moment. Very few people consistently repeat thoughtful behaviors without genuine motivation supporting them. Repetition eliminates coincidence. Suppose someone repeatedly remembers meaningful dates, repeatedly follows through, repeatedly communicates with honesty, repeatedly demonstrates respect. Eventually those actions stop looking accidental. They become characteristic. Character is simply repeated behavior observed across time. That's why professionals avoid making conclusions too early. One interaction provides possibilities. 20 interactions provide patterns. Patterns deserve attention because they reduce the influence of temporary emotion. Another remarkable shift occurs when future conversations begin assuming continuity. Notice the wording. I'll tell you next week. Remind me later. When we talk again. These simple phrases reveal an expectation that communication will continue. That expectation reflects psychological continuity. The relationship is no longer treated like a temporary encounter. It becomes part of the anticipated future. No dramatic announcement is necessary. Behavior quietly communicates the expectation. Perhaps the most overlooked change of all is emotional ease. People stop trying to impress every minute. They become comfortable admitting mistakes, changing opinions, laughing at themselves, asking for advice, saying, "I don't know." These moments might appear ordinary. They're anything but. They represent confidence that authenticity is safer than performance. That confidence rarely develops overnight. It grows through repeated experiences where openness is met with understanding instead of rejection. This is why the strongest behavioral evidence almost never comes from one unforgettable conversation. It comes from dozens of ordinary interactions that gradually become more consistent, more reciprocal, more relaxed, and more genuine. By the time those changes become obvious, they usually didn't happen suddenly. They were developing quietly all along, one conversation at a time, one thoughtful choice at a time, one dependable action after another. One principle separates careful behavioral observation from simple guesswork. People don't just communicate with words. They communicate with patterns. Patterns reveal where attention goes when no one is watching. Think about how habits form. A habit is simply a behavior repeated often enough that it requires less conscious effort. Relationships develop habits too. There are habits of communication, habits of listening, habits of checking in, habits of showing appreciation. These routines quietly shape the emotional climate between two people. When someone returns after a long absence, one of the first questions to ask is not, "What did they say?" It's, "What habits are beginning to appear?" Are conversations becoming more regular? Do they remember where you left off the last time you spoke? Do they naturally return to unfinished discussions? Habits tell a much richer story than isolated emotional moments. Another fascinating observation concerns emotional predictability. The human nervous system prefers environments it can understand. This doesn't mean life becomes boring. It means people generally feel more comfortable when they know roughly how someone will respond during ordinary situations. If someone repeatedly demonstrates patience, honesty, and consistency, uncertainty begins to decrease. As uncertainty decreases, defensive behavior often decreases as well. People stop preparing for disappointment every time the phone vibrates. They stop analyzing every sentence for hidden meaning. They become more present. Presence is difficult to appreciate until anxiety disappears. Now think about the difference between reaction and response. A reaction is immediate. A response is considered. Behavioral analysts pay close attention to this distinction because thoughtful responses usually involve greater emotional regulation. Suppose a misunderstanding occurs. One person immediately assumes the worst. Another pauses, asks questions, and seeks clarification. Those two approaches produce very different outcomes over time. The ability to pause before reaching conclusions is one of the strongest indicators of emotional maturity. Maturity creates stability. Stability creates trust. Trust creates openness. Notice how each layer naturally supports the next. And another behavior worth observing is whether someone becomes increasingly transparent. Transparency doesn't mean revealing every private thought. It means reducing unnecessary ambiguity. Instead of disappearing without explanation, they communicate. Instead of leaving important questions unanswered, they acknowledge them. Instead of expecting you to guess their intentions, they provide enough information to reduce confusion. Clarity is an act of consideration. It tells the other person that their emotional experience matters. Many conflicts grow not because people disagree, but because uncertainty fills the empty spaces between interactions. Reducing unnecessary uncertainty often strengthens relationships more than dramatic, emotional speeches ever could. Now observe attention during ordinary moments. Anyone can be fully engaged during exciting conversations. What happens during routine conversations? Do they still seem interested? Do they ask thoughtful follow-up questions? Do they notice subtle changes in your perspective? Interest that survives ordinary life is often more meaningful than excitement that only appears during extraordinary moments. Ordinary days reveal extraordinary priorities. Behavioral psychology repeatedly reminds us that repeated attention reflects perceived value. Attention is expensive. Every moment spent listening to someone is a moment unavailable for something else. People constantly make those choices without consciously realizing it. Where attention repeatedly flows, significance often follows. Another subtle indicator involves emotional influence. Not control, influence. Healthy relationships naturally shape one another. One person's optimism encourages another. One person's calm reduces another's stress. One person's discipline inspires another's consistency. Influence develops because repeated interaction gradually changes expectations and habits. Think about language again. Has someone's vocabulary around the relationship become more collaborative? Do they reference shared experiences naturally? Do they include your perspective when discussing decisions that affect both of you? These changes usually emerge gradually. They don't require dramatic announcements. They simply become normal. Normal is where meaningful relationships spend most of their time. The movies focus on dramatic reunions. Real life is usually built during quiet Tuesday afternoons. That's where trust either grows or fades. One dependable conversation, one fulfilled commitment, one respectful disagreement, one thoughtful check-in, again and again. Observe how someone handles your independence. Healthy connection doesn't require constant contact. In many cases, respect for another person's responsibilities, friendships, and personal goals actually strengthens trust. When someone supports your growth, rather than competing with it, they're communicating confidence instead of insecurity. Confidence reduces unnecessary pressure. Pressure often weakens authentic communication. People speak more honestly when they don't feel forced. Another fascinating behavioral principle is emotional congruence. Congruence simply means internal consistency. Do facial expressions match words? Does tone align with the message? Do actions reinforce promises? The greater the alignment, the easier someone becomes to understand. Predictable people are easier to trust because they create fewer psychological contradictions. The brain relaxes when reality consistently matches expectation. One more pattern deserves attention. Repair attempts become faster. Earlier, misunderstandings may have lasted weeks. Now they become conversations lasting minutes or hours. Why? Because preserving understanding becomes more important than protecting pride. This shift often develops quietly. No one announces it. They simply become more willing to resolve issues before unnecessary distance grows. Resolution reflects investment. People usually spend effort repairing relationships they genuinely value. Finally, notice whether appreciation becomes more visible. Not exaggerated praise. Simple acknowledgement, thanking you for listening, recognizing your support, remembering your kindness, expressing genuine enjoyment of your company. Appreciation reinforces positive behavior. It tells another person that their presence is noticed, rather than taken for granted. Over time, these small expressions create an emotional environment where trust, openness, and consistency become increasingly natural. And when those qualities begin appearing together, not once, not twice, but across many, ordinary interactions, they often tell a clearer story than any dramatic declaration ever could. Because meaningful change is rarely hidden inside one unforgettable conversation. It's revealed through the quiet repetition of behaviors that continue long after the excitement of reconnecting has faded, leaving behind something much more valuable, a pattern that is steady enough to earn confidence instead of merely demanding hope.